Welcome to A Walk in the Park with Gil, where every other week I invite fascinating people to talk about cities. Sometimes it's about parks, others about walking, riding bicycles, using public transit, or children and elders in cities, public health, the environment, and much more. My name is Gil Penalosa, and I was born in Bogota, Colombia, where as commissioner, I led the design and construction of over 200 parks and took a small program of open streets called Ciclovia and turned it into the world's largest pop-up park with 121 kilometers, 76 miles of car-free streets where people of all ages and backgrounds enjoy the presence of each other as equals. 17 years ago, I created 880 Cities, a non-profit organization based in Toronto, Canada, where I live. Before the pandemic, I had worked in 345 cities in all continents, which is why my master classes now are called Gil in 345 Cities. This bi-weekly webinar is a way of giving back, always free. Invite anyone who cares about cities and people to join us. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Brent is an old friend. We've been working in many cities around the world, and he is fantastic. He has so much knowledge and so much experience. Of course, he was the chief planner in Vancouver. But other than that, he's been advising cities from Medellin, Colombia, to cities in Holland, in Africa, all over the world. And one of the things that I love about Brent is that he says things as he sees them. Too many planners are politically correct. I think that we need to be respectful, but not politically correct. We need to say things as we see them because there is a huge urgency. This amazing, huge amount of people, Brent, is because of you, isn't it? Not because of me. Otherwise, they would have been here 2 weeks ago. I want to thank you very, very much for having accepted this invitation. This is a critical topic that every city around the world is dealing with, the density versus nature in cities. Because we will say, oh, if we have density, we cannot have nature. If we have nature, we cannot have density. And obviously, that's not the case. So I'm going to leave it now to Brent. He's going to tell you a little bit about himself. And then he's going to have a fabulous presentation. And then we're going to have a dialogue, Brent and I. And if you have any questions, keep in mind that during the sessions, we use the chat only before the presentation and after the presentation, not during the presentation, because during the presentation, we want you to focus on the presentation. However, if you have questions, please feel totally at ease to ask the Q&A. Brent, thank you. Welcome.
My pleasure. Hello. Good morning, everyone from Vancouver. Good afternoon if you're somewhere else, or good evening. I am always willing to say yes to Gil when he calls. Once I needed help in this kind of thing too, and I reached out to Gil, and he got right on it and helped me out with a keynote that I really needed badly for an organization I was leading. And I always said to Gil, anytime you call, I'll return the favor, of course. So I'm very glad to do this for an old friend. When he asked me, what do you want to talk about? I said, oh, we have so many conversations about city making, which is wonderful, but what to do to actually maybe be a little original in terms of specifically what we want to talk about today. And I've been certainly feeling like the conversation about density and urbanization of cities and how to do it well successfully has in many cases often been charged with this false choice of density versus nature, cities versus nature. And I've been lately calling BS on a lot of the false choices that are embedded in our city conversations. Fast versus good is one of the most important false choices out there right now, that we can build and design our city either fast or good. We can't do it both. So I'm right versus left in terms of political dichotomies. And certainly density versus nature is one of the biggest false choices out there. So I decided to tackle that. But what do we actually talk about when we're having that conversation? And one of the first thoughts I had was, are some people going to call BS on this very basic concept? Because is nature in cities an oxymoron? If you are urban, by definition, are you the opposite of nature? Can urban ever be natural? And obviously it's a measure of scale. But for some people, nature is what happens in cities when the apocalypse happens or the viral apocalypse happens and all the humans are wiped out, and then nature can return to cities. That's literally how some people have put the question to me in the past, that nature is something that will take over once we are all gone. And it's part of this conversation that cities can't be natural, cities can't be nature. But I wanted to go upstream a bit and talk about a broader concept. Are cities green? Because not everything that's green has nature in it. And certainly in the context of something like climate change, you can have very leafy green suburbs that are fundamentally not green in the context of mitigation of climate change. And you can have very urban settings where you actually can't even see a tree. And that is very green in the context of lowering our per capita greenhouse gas emissions and intensifying our urban living so that we can actually leave the natural areas alone and the rural areas with less pressure associated with them. So this conversation of are cities inherently green is really interesting. But I actually went one step further and said, I actually believe that cities are inherently green because they are inherently greener than the alternative, which is dealing with the population of the planet Earth in other patterns that are less concentrated. And certainly in the Western world, where lack of concentration means more driving usually. So cities are inherently green, but the question is, are they inherently green enough? Are they green enough? And that really comes down to the details. And I'm going to try to answer that in the context of this presentation. First of all, when I'm talking about green, I'm talking in the context of one of 5 crises that our Canadian cities are actually facing right now. And I almost always talk about all 5 and the integration, the interconnection between these 5 crises: the climate crisis, the housing and homelessness crisis, the equity crisis, which relates to racism and equity and access to the city for all, the public health crisis that predates this pandemic in the context of obesogenic environments, particularly suburbs where we have designed physical activity out of our cities. And yes, the infrastructure crisis, the taxation crisis, the fiscal crisis in cities, where we are literally building expansion of our cities and suburbs in ways that we cannot afford economically. All of these conversations are interconnected, all are important to talk about, but today I'm going to be talking about largely the first one, the green and the climate crisis. And yes, we should be. I hope to God everybody on this call does not need to be convinced that the way we plan cities and suburbs is probably the most fundamental thing that we can do to mitigate climate change, period, full stop. And I hope there are no still climate deniers on this call. So I certainly don't waste my time with any of those because I listened to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the actual experts. And I hope you were all paying attention a few months ago when the Intergovernmental Panel released by far their bluntest, most aggressive report on the climate emergency, the climate crisis, using language that climate scientists are not known for in terms of their bluntness and their lack of political correctness. And for the first time ever, they really focused on cities specifically and how fast cities need to transform. Within 3 years, we need to be basically transforming our cities, or else we're just turning the dial on the severity of the implications of the climate emergency. So it is climate crisis stupid, whether everyone wants to admit it or not. And I say that when Doug Ford admits that this is about climate change and actually starts to connect the dots between how we build things, although often in the wrong ways, I should emphasize, you cannot justify the widening or the creation of a new highway based on climate change because you say that it's going to reduce idling from congestion, because we know that infrastructure just induces more driving. But it's important that even the right-wing political leaders are not at least denying climate change anymore, except for folks like Trump out there. It's interesting, though, that in the rest of the world where Gil and I work regularly, they're not necessarily always talking about climate change specifically. But in European cities, for example, the major conversation about city change is about pollution, air pollution, as it relates to urban health and quality of life. And they also talk about emissions for climate change, obviously. But they actually really want people to think about the thing they're already feeling right now, which is whether or not there's smog in the city, whether or not the air is dangerous to breathe and tough to breathe. And so the conversation in European city after European city, when they're talking about green cities and particularly taming the car, is first and foremost a conversation about urban pollution, a conversation about quality of life and livability and economic success and social and environmental success in the city. And yes, it's also about climate mitigation, but they don't necessarily lead with that latter part, which I find very politically astute. I'm not a big fan of the debate and discussion about climate change mitigation versus adaptation, so I'm just going to say really quick, we do both. There's too much emphasis on adaptation, which I tweeted about last night if you want to see my comments on that. But what I say is, of course, we address both, but we actually need to address mitigation extensively, excessively, more so, because mitigation will determine what reality, what awful reality we actually have to try to adapt to. Plus, I also say it is the height of human hubris to think that we can actually adapt to climate change, the climate crisis, even that we can assume all the implications of it. Because, you know, it's not just storm events and wildfires and floods. It's also things like more and worse pandemics, which is something that we rarely talk about in the context of climate change, but should be talking about. So adaptation, how do you adapt in Vancouver, for example, where sea level rise, even before flash floods and intense storms, or even after them, you're going to have eventual sea level rise. That's very tough, very expensive to actually mitigate. And this is, before I planned for Vancouver as chief planner, I was a top planner in Calgary. I was actually in charge of downtown and center city planning. So it was heartbreaking to see this kind of flood event happen in Calgary a few years ago. And this is supposed to be the 1 in 100 storm, or even the 1 in 200 storm, but it's happening potentially every 10 years now. And those are the implications. And how do you adapt to that? How do you respond to that? First of all, it takes an awful lot of money, but we're kidding ourselves to think that we can even adapt to it. So climate change mitigation has to be our priority. The bad news is technology is not going to save us. It won't be electric cars. It won't be self-driving vehicles that actually saves us from the climate crisis. Frankly, there's a very good chance that new technology will just lead to more driving and more emissions. You can see my various tweets on that subject for more of that. It won't be about the technology part of smart cities, because, you know, the Mazdars of the world, the green gizmo cities of the world, where you try to gizmo up a city in fundamentally the wrong place, like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or Abu Dhabi. This isn't going to be the solution. I said this in Wired magazine when they asked me to comment on Masdar. New technology can be advantageous, but it doesn't replace compact, walkable, complete communities and a good relationship between housing and employment. The fundamentals, as I call it. If you want technology to help you go further, by all means, let's have that conversation about smart technology, but it never will replace the fundamentals. It may just collect good data to tell us how fundamentally bad we're doing and how much we're failing in terms of the fundamentals and actual green cities. I was just working in Guelph last week and having some tough conversations about whether that particular city, Guelph, Canada, was a green city. And at the beginning of my presentation, I put up their own goal, which was to cut their emissions in half by 2030. Based on 2020 starting point. And they were going to drop per capita climate emissions by 63% in just 8 years by 2030. And they say the decision puts climate action at the center of all decision making. The problem is, I reported to them that their actual actions, their actual targets for mode shift, their conversation around density and height didn't go nearly far enough, fast enough to actually achieve that goal. They would be lucky if they achieved 63% per capita reduction by 2050 at the pace they're going, let alone 2030. And this is the kind of candid conversation we have, whether it's declaration of a climate emergency, like cities like Vancouver and the city I advise in Ontario, Kingston, has done, or any other, whether it's carbon neutrality or becoming a carbon zero city, the money is where your mouth is, where the rubber hits the road, to use that metaphor. The actions you actually take, the targets you set, how seriously you take them, and the actions you actually set will make the difference. So I asked Guelph, what would it really take to reach 63% reduction in per capita emissions by 2030? What would it really take for Vancouver to become the greenest city in the world by 2020, which is a goal we set back in, I think, around 2012? And the answer is, it would take a lot more than any city I've seen is doing. There's a lot of different ways you can tackle this question of green city, but I'm going to boil it down into really 3 deliberately overly simplistic elements. How does your city handle density, cars, and trees? Frankly, you can tell me an awful lot about whether a city is really green by me looking at how you handle density, cars, and trees. So let's talk about those a bit. I talk about what I call density done well, not just lazy, badly done density that actually can ironically be more car dependent, and certainly can turn the public against density and height. It's done so badly. But all the things that density, if you do it well, reduction of energy uses, facilitating active transport, more green design options, less sprawl, more affordability, et cetera, come with density done well. This is a slide I created about 16 years ago now, when I first became chief planner of Vancouver and wanted to have a conversation about density done well compared to density done poorly. And let's talk about the elephant under the table, which is tall buildings. Height is not inherently green. Height can actually, if it's too tall, above about 60 to 65 floors, it's almost hard to have it be green because so much embedded energy in the concrete and steel to keep it up, at least from an building energy perspective. You can still be green if it's in the right place relative to transportation mode shift, but it's really hard to be a green design building if it's fundamentally too tall. And that cutoff is about 60 to 65 stories. But height can enable more density. Frankly, it should enable more density. That's the primary reason to do height, in my opinion. And more density is inherently green. So that's where the height conversation fits into my conversation about density. But to focus on an illustration that isn't tall in Vancouver. This is our athletes' village, our Olympic village from the 2010 Winter Games. The US Green Building Council called it the greenest community in North America, at least the greenest community that went through the LEED ND points, because this is still 12 years later, the highest number of LEED ND points ever granted to a community. Public realm, green space integrated into the urban design, and part of a larger neighborhood that's been built out since the Olympics. But absolute innovation by North American standards, not by European and Australian standards, but by North American standards around reteaching ourselves how to do passive design in terms of cooling and natural ventilation, automatic shading, passive solar shading, light access, so you don't have to keep the lights on for things like your stairwell to reduce energy. We found in Vancouver that this taught us how to drop the energy load by about 30% right off the bat just from passive design. And around the time when we brought this in, we actually became the first city to pass a rule that all projects, private sector projects, had to be LEED Gold with 6 energy points if it went through a rezoning process, which is a lot of applications in Vancouver. But since then, the city has continued to evolve well past using LEED as a standard for regulation in cities. And now, of course, the step code and the passive design has been integrated into a performance-based code at the city level and then eventually at the British Columbia provincial level. But all of the learnings from the Olympic Village were transformative across the city and then ultimately to the provincial code and even the national code. Obviously, rainwater collection, how we use water, even solar in a rainy city is important. And the big deal, neighborhood energy utility, district energy, the game changer, by far the largest neighborhood energy or district energy system basic in North America, capturing waste heat from the sewage system to heat the space and the water. And this was where we got, after dropping your energy load by 30%, this is where things went even further. And we brought in a new policy in 2010 that said all sites 2 acres or above had to do a district energy strategy, had to, for it to be feasibly considered by council. So let's switch gear for a second. If we're, that's the kind of built form conversation we're having, but the transportation piece is critically important to green cities. And what I would say is the number one thing you could do around greenness is prioritize your modes of transportation, like Vancouver did in 1997 in their downtown, in the city's transportation plan. Not balancing modes, because I often say that balance is just code for the status quo, only slightly better. Walking first, then biking, then public transit, then goods movement, and then the car. And of course, walking includes all kinds of human mobility, wheelchair for disability access, etc. All of that as part of what we frankly sometimes too lazily refer to as walking. But that's the first priority. And this is a sustainability strategy. It's an equity strategy. It's a mobility strategy when you realize that if everyone's trying to drive in a city, nobody can move because of geography. So we emphasize walking and all the simple and complex things that actually facilitate a more walkable city. We obviously stress the importance of separated, protected bike lanes, because that's the only way you get to bike mode shift, an increasing of bike mode share in your city. Painted bike lanes and sharrows do not work and actually can make the situation more dangerous for people on bikes. So you need a network of protected bike lanes. Like we've been doing over years, frankly, too slowly, in my opinion, in Vancouver, but over the years, and stressing what we call AAA in Vancouver, all age and abilities. That really riffs off Gill's 8 to 80 approach to everything in cities, but certainly safe and comfortable cycling infrastructure. Public transit, yes, it's about the big order public transit like light rail, but I often say the unsung heroes for a sustainable and green city are the buses, and that drawing down at the bottom is our frequent transit network. Frequent, low headway, a bus comes, if you miss that bus, the next one comes within 6 to 8 minutes. That is how you cover the entire city with really convenient and predictable transit, where if you miss one bus, you don't even worry about it because the next one's coming along. And that, yes, even car share, which actually goes a long way in actually reducing the amount of parking that you need to build in your cities. Because what we found in many, many cities is that you can have walking, biking, and transit work well, but people still keep their car for that proverbial trip to IKEA once every few months, or the trip into Whistler for skiing. But car share and the ability to rent a car easy, it allows us to get from a low car use city to a low car ownership city. So don't underestimate the strategic importance of car share and how it partners with walking, biking, and transit. And by the way, as I talk about parking, you can't be a green city unless you fundamentally rethought your approach to parking. This is from the recent work that I did in Kingston, where we just got council approval of a 180-degree transformed approach to parking based on a conversation we had citywide called The Power of Parking. And it shows that cities of every size, every scale, every vintage, every country or continent can fundamentally and has to fundamentally rethink their conversation and ultimately their rules as quickly as possible on parking. Because of course, the real parking problem is that we're providing way too much parking, and cities are actually mandating way too much parking. And an American publication gave probably the best headline I ever saw for work that I was involved with, which was "Steal This Idea," because I actually do think all of us should be stealing and being inspired by other cities and thinking about how those great ideas in cities of every scale can translate to our particular city. So the third element is trees. And if you think that trees are just a nice to have, it really concerns to me that trees are still often perceived as something that's kind of aesthetic at best. Trees are one of the most pragmatic things that we can build into our cities. I call it essential infrastructure. When you think about all the things that trees do for us, it's a no-brainer to invest in trees. If you're thinking about tree canopy creation as a cost, you're thinking wrong. It's an investment. It's a cost saver. And this is how you have to have the conversation. And I'm saying this not as a tree hugger, a term that I hate, because we tend to perceive this idea that the people who are supporting trees are a certain type of person that goes out and hugs trees. I'm a city planner who understands how cities succeed. And it's through that pragmatic lens that I say trees are one of the most significant no-brainers of anything that we can do in our city building. Look at absorption of rainfall for the purposes of flood mitigation. Look at temperature mitigation in the context of the urban heat island, something that's been getting so much attention quite rightly. It's about future-proofing our cities, providing shade. I don't know why as cities we are so obsessed with sunlight access to our streets. I'm actually, having worked in Australia and many other hot places, I'm at least as interested in sunlight mitigation in the context of a heating world and heating cities. So we need to be building this kind of perspective into our street design, the cooling, all the benefits of trees, all the things that they give us well beyond the aesthetics. So important to conversation. So let's talk about another elephant from under the table. We've been talking about cities, but let's talk about suburbs. Can a suburb ever really be green? And the irony is, if you're just looking at color, suburbs are seen a lot more green than cities are. They can be green leafy suburbs, for example, but there's almost nothing fundamentally green about suburbs, certainly nothing fundamentally green about sprawl, which is a certain kind of suburb, if you will. And I often talk about this question: can a green building, usually in the middle of sprawl, really be green? The proverbial Walmart with solar panels and windmills on the top, as just a better an approach to doing the wrong thing better, the wrong thing in a car-oriented suburban sprawl, but with some gadgets on it that make it greener. By all means, if you're going to do the wrong thing, do the wrong thing better. If you're going to do a Walmart, do it with as many green gadgets as you can that actually work, but never mistake that for being green. There's nothing green about a Walmart, a car-dependent Walmart in the middle of sprawl. And this is really important for us to talk about, because the success or failure of our city regions, and ultimately our survival in the context of climate change, depends entirely on how well we do our suburbs, because that's where most of us in North America live, and in Australia and even in Europe. That's where most of us are still going, notwithstanding successes around infill and downtown housing, etc. So we need to do our suburbs fundamentally differently. And not all suburbia is sprawl, but too much of it is. And what I say is that the number one variable that determines the difference between suburb and sprawl is car dependency. So if you are designing a place where other choices are not enjoyable, transportation and mobility choices that are greener, more equitable, more healthy are enjoyable, you are still creating sprawl. And we need to be talking about the fact that we are planning, approving massive amounts of sprawl still, while at the same time as talking about green cities. So we're digging ourselves deeper and deeper in that hole. And by the way, in the evolution of suburbs, this is some images from my friend Brent Bellamy in Winnipeg. This is Winnipeg. I often say that whether or not you can actually achieve trees, street trees in particular, not just park trees and yard trees, but street trees in particular, it's probably the single biggest determiner about whether or not your suburban neighborhood is going to get better over time instead of getting worse over time, just getting older over time. This is a Winnipeg suburb when it was first built, and the Winnipeg suburb where it is now. And I used to show, when I was a planner for Calgary, I used to show the evolution of a green leafy suburb in the context of street trees, and then the evolution of a suburb 20, 30 years later where no street trees were put in. And it just got older, but it certainly didn't get better in the context of actually that mature tree canopy growing up. And I'll talk a bit more about street trees a little later. The key problem with sprawl is auto dependency. If we don't deal with car dependency, there is no chance that suburbs will ever be green, ever. A low density. And this is something important for the conservation authorities out there, the folks that think if you just preserve the environmental feature as you're building sprawl unfettered, then you're saving the environment. So I want to say this clearly: a low density car dependent suburb that manages to avoid, by regulation, building in wetlands or in flood areas isn't green. And this is a message I actually gave to conservation authorities at their annual national meeting a few years ago. We are so focused on preserving the environmental feature, which we should, but it's got to be in the context of urbanization, mode shift, higher mixed use densities, etc. Because if not, we're just putting circles around the environmental features as we destroy the environment. So can a suburb ever be really green? No. And a sprawl can be leafy. Sprawl can be leafy, but it can never really be green as long as it is car dependent. So we can have a conversation about suburbs becoming green, but sprawl, car dependency, will never be green. So in the context of city or suburb, I say that green is how we think about every element of city making. It's not just about nature integrated into city environments. It's every element of how we do green city making. And I almost don't like talking about green cities or sustainable cities anymore. For me, it's just good city planning or bad city planning. It's like equity. It's just built in, or you're doing a bad job, is the way I look at it. So, but now let's just talk about nature specifically. What about nature specifically in the cities? And I still live in downtown Vancouver. I planned for Vancouver. Vancouver is often referenced as a city that is embedded in nature. It's not as much about whether nature is in the city. In Vancouver's case, it's the city is in nature. And one of the best things about Vancouver is that I can take a 30 to 40 minute bus ride, not car drive, but bus ride, and I can be in real nature. I can access that nature from my urban environment, real nature, very quickly, and even through public transit. And to me, that's one of the keys to whether your city is connected to nature, not just visually connected, but physically connected for its people. So step one at a regional scale is, what's your integration of nature? What's your integration with nature so that your public can access real nature relatively easily without a car whenever you want to? But then we have this conversation about integrating nature in, and whether that's green streets, living walls, green roofs, every element of building green into architectural design, public realm design, etc., is a very exciting approach to better design. And to me, this is, again, a no-brainer. It shouldn't be seen as a radical idea or a one-off. It should just be part of density done well. And when we show examples like this, whenever I tweet things like this, it gets so much attention because, and this was a proposed transformation in the UK, it's because it shows that actual urbanism, actual urbanity, real density is not at odds with nature, because you can fit integrating nature into your highly urban environments. It fits, and it's not at odds with population density. It's not at odds with building density. What it really is at odds with is car density. The number one thing that keeps nature out of cities is not density of people, it's not density of buildings, it's density of cars, and how much space we've surrendered to cars. And by the way, cars density is also the thing that keeps out public life and keeps out urban livability. It keeps out everything because it's taken so much space. And this is a fundamental truth. If you think density and nature are at odds, population density and building density is not at odds with nature, but car density is at odds with nature. So when you're talking about all these grand urban visions of still having all this density, but greening almost everything you can, greening almost every surface, certainly at grade, but also vertically in the context of green buildings and green roofs and living walls, the variable that you need to affect is cars, because that's what you need to actually have space. So let's talk about different ways to integrate nature. And this is our convention center. These are the big opportunities that you have. The idea of creating this whole landscape for biodiversity, for urban cooling, for building cooling in the context of our convention center, this kind of mound and hill of green in the context of a highly urban setting. This is I think still the largest, I think this is the second largest green roof in North America, the largest in sort of Western North America in our convention center. Still a success. Bees, other habitat and biodiversity supports up there, and all sorts of green benefits. You've got it green integrated into the obvious things like our parks, which is sort of the easy part of integrating nature, integrating green into our cities. Whether that park is more urban or more naturalized, you're still having that conversation about integrating green in. I say don't underestimate the power of courtyards. Certainly during the pandemic, we really were reminded of the importance of things like balconies and courtyards in creating respite and green and access to the outside and fresh air while you were in a highly urbanized setting every day, but certainly during a pandemic. These happen to be images from my courtyard. This is literally what I look out my office window at, of my home office, both in summer and winter. And this is my kids' primary access to immediate nature, because I can almost not see the courtyard because of the trees that have grown up, because they were allowed through the growing medium to grow quite substantial and weren't kept artificially small in the design of our courtyard. Don't underestimate the importance of this kind of green integrated into urban, because this is a building form, 2 tall towers and a mid-rise with townhouses fronting onto an elevated courtyard, but right in the middle of it, a moment of nature, a moment of green, a moment of respite in the context of one of the most urban, dense buildings in the entire city. And yes, of course, natural amenities like our seawall, integration of nature at high levels into our recreational pathways. But I often say this is the easy part because the cars aren't here. So you're not competing with cars for that space. But certainly our seawall, our trail systems that many other cities have, great opportunities to do a lot of urban greening over and above parks and expanding the tree canopy significantly in your city for urban cooling and all the other benefits. But this is the easy part because there aren't any cars there. As soon as you get into the streets, then you have to be designing for trees specifically. You've got to be making the space for trees, even as you are doing more density. So this is along a podium, wide sidewalks, double row of trees, integrated landscape with an elevated front to the urban townhouses that frame the tree. All of this celebrates the walker and make it a much more enjoyable place to walk, but it's because you gave the space. This is other contexts. The top one is a building, the street that I first lived on when I first moved to Vancouver. You can do remarkable things with both density and urban greening and street trees particularly, if you just give the space at the block edge. We tend to think that you can't do an urban project if there are trees there. You can if you just make decisions about that setback. It's really that street edge that determines whether or not you're going to have street trees, whether or not you're going to have good yard trees, and create a kissing canopy of trees, not only over the street carriageway, but over the sidewalk too. So it's really about that decision. And don't tell me, no developer or no city can tell me that there isn't room for trees, because all of the examples I'm showing you are very dense. They're very dense. There is a room if the city mandates it to say, we want a great green experience at grade. This project is just up the hill from me in downtown Vancouver, a kissing canopy, not only over the street, but over the sidewalk, triple row of trees. You've got 2 yard trees and a street tree. Room in the underground facilitated this being possible because they prioritize trees in the actual underground utility provision and services, etc. But look at that image down at the bottom. That's the tree canopy and how mature it got because it was designed to allow the trees to mature. And that's the density that it's next to. It's running along the podium of a podium and 2 tower project. Very dense, very urban, very tall, but at grade, you'd never know it and you'd never care because you're in a wonderful microclimate that frankly, those are my kids in the picture. It's their favorite street to walk on as we walk into the downtown because of the gorgeous microclimate even on a really hot day. So however you integrate street trees in, how you prioritize street trees in the context of a trees first attitude to the cross-section design and the underground utilities and services that either facilitate or kill the idea of street trees, that's how you get street trees. That kissing canopy in the winter is Winnipeg, Barcelona, other examples from all over the world where you're able to allow not just a presence of street trees, a survival of street trees, because let's face it, a lot of the time we design them to die, it seems, but actually a flourishing of street trees so they mature and get better as they go, all critical to the most obvious integration opportunity for nature in our cities, for everything from urban cooling to stormwater management to quality of life and livability. Then we have other big opportunities, the burying of freeways. This is my clients, Medellin, Colombia. One of the things I helped them with was the idea of burying their river choking freeways with an urban park, connecting the downtown to the river, but also creating this incredible opportunity for new green. How obviously Highline in New York City, we're again taking an opportunity to do something above grade, but out of the box, transformative thinking about the integration of green in cities, because we need that. We need to be thinking out of the box around unusual opportunities, because it's really hard for cities to keep up on buying land to do traditional parks at grade. So we need to think up and down and over and covering and every possible opportunity to add green. The re-daylighting, obviously, of former streams is a massive opportunity in cities, not only for nature, but quality of life and livability. This is, of course, the incredibly inspirational Seoul, Korea, where they did all this and also made the traffic better through the provision of actual public transit. So there's fewer cars, less congestion, but also this incredible green and natural and amenity opportunity. So density done well is still my approach to how I tackle all density conversations in cities. And let's be clear, nature integrated into density is a critical element of density done well, but nature also needs density done well too, because the more we accommodate people and economic activity, et cetera, into the urban environment, the more we're protecting all nature, including the nature out there that we don't want to build cities on top of. So this interrelation, this partnership between good urbanism and real nature and integrated nature into a successful combination that mitigates climate emergency and just provides for better urban livability, all of it is critically important to a real conversation around better cities and protecting nature. So for God's sakes, let's stop talking about the false choice of density versus nature. Thank you very much. Thanks, Gil. I'm not sure how I went for time, and hopefully we still have time for some good conversation between the two of us.
This is magnificent. I think Brent has given us dozens and dozens and dozens of ideas, and I'm amazed that we have hundreds and hundreds of people, and 90% are still on, even though we went over 10 minutes. Brent, I'm really, really, really grateful that you came on board. This has been really fantastic. I also want to invite you in 2 weeks from now and invite everybody. That is the new National Urban Parks Program in Canada and Rouge National Urban Park. Brent, this has been magnificent. Please share this with decision makers, with colleagues, with people that need to learn about nature and cities and density, because there is too many blah, 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 and not enough data and not enough reasons. And I think Brent has made a magnificent case that this has to do with mental health and physical health and climate change and economic development, and just being able for all citizens, regardless of their background, to be able to live healthier and happier. Brent, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Gil. Anytime. Nice to see everyone. Thank you.